So I see that we're doing this again. Apologies if I get a bit nervous, but let's go ahead. We were asked 4 different questions. We were given 4 different prompts that we need to respond to. So I'm just gonna go ahead and begin. The first one we were given was defend the perspective that the first step in the 5-step decision-making model is the most important. Well, I think the first step in the 5-step decision-making model is probably the most important one. Because if you don't define the problem correctly, everything after that can kind of just fall apart, right? What I mean by this is like decision making, it only works if you're actually solving the right issue. If the problem is misunderstood or it's framed incorrectly, then every step after that, whether it's evaluating alternatives, choosing a solution, it's all basically built on a mistake. So the steps in the model were to define the problem, identify and weigh the criteria, generate alternatives, rate those alternatives, and then choose, implement, and evaluate, right? That's what we learned. But that first step really determines the direction of everything else. What it does is it shapes what information you're focusing on, what options you even consider, and even how you interpret success at the end. And I think in real life, this is where a lot of the mistakes happen. People often rush into solving things because there's pressure to act quickly, especially in a workplace setting. But acting fast doesn't always mean that you're acting correctly. For example, someone might see a drop in performance and immediately assume that the issue is employee effort. They wouldn't think of anything else. So they might focus on discipline or stricter policies when really they needed to take a different alternative because it had nothing to do with the employee effort. But if the real issue is unclear communication or lack of training, then the solution doesn't actually fix anything. I've seen this idea play out even in the smaller situations too, actually. Sometimes people argue or they try to fix a situation without really agreeing on what the actual problem is in the first place. So the conversation just goes in circles and circles and circles, just goes round and round and round until you're dizzy. And that's why I think defining the problem is not just the first step. It's almost like the filter that everything else has to pass through. And if that filter is wrong, then everything else becomes less effective. And it's pretty much wrong too. So yeah, I'd say the first step is the foundation of the entire process. And the stronger that foundation is, the more reliable the final decision will be, right? Okay, so moving on. Our second question was, in what types of work situations would satisficing be appropriate? List at least 3 occupations or industries where satisficing would not be an appropriate strategy for decision making. Okay, so this is a big one. So satisficing makes the most sense when decisions have to be made quickly and the stakes aren't extremely high. They're medium, low, in that range. And instead of trying to find the absolute best option, what you do is you go with something that works well enough to keep things moving. And honestly, I think a lot of people use satisficing more than we actually realize. In real workplace environments, you don't always have the time, the information, or the resources to analyze every possible option. So you end up making the best decision you can with what you have at that moment, right? So, for example, when I worked at America's Best, I know we're tired about hearing America's Best, so am I. But when I worked there were a lot of situations where things changed quickly. Someone might call out, or a customer might need immediate assistance, or something in the workflow might slow everything down. In those moments, you don't really get the chance to sit down and evaluate every option carefully. You just respond. You make a decision and you keep things moving along so that the operation doesn't fall behind. And I think that customer service overall is a good example of this. Customers usually want fast responses. They want on the nose, quick response. They don't want to have to sit there and wait for you to just think and analyze. So if you spend too much time trying to find the perfect solution, you can actually make the situation worse because the customer becomes more frustrated. So in that sense, a good enough solution that resolves the issue quickly is often more effective than a perfect solution that takes too long. Like event planning is another very strong example. Things change constantly. Vendors cancel, schedules change, weather conditions change. So planners often have to adjust in real time instead of waiting for an ideal condition. They don't know what's going to happen or what's going to be thrown at them. They just have to adjust to it. Even in school group projects, like I do a lot of these days. I've done them in the past. Least favorite thing. But even in school group projects, satisficing shows up. You might not get the perfect idea from every person, but you move forward with the option that works best for the group as a whole so that you can actually finish the assignment, right? But there are definitely situations where satisficing would not be appropriate at all. For example, surgeons cannot afford to make good enough decisions during their procedures. That's terrible. The risk would be way too high. So every decision has to be precise because the risk is too high. They don't want to harm their patient. They want to do what's best for them. The same applies to air traffic controllers. They're responsible for coordinating multiple aircrafts at once. There's no room for shortcuts or assumptions there. There's no room for mistake. It can cause some serious problems. And engineers designing structures or systems also can't rely on things like satisficing, because even the smallest errors can create serious safety risks later on. So I think that satisficing is actually a very useful decision-making strategy, but only when the situation is something that allows for flexibility. It really depends on the level of risk that you're taking, the amount of time you have available, and how serious the consequences are or can be. That's how I see that. Number 3 was discuss the relationship between creativity and innovation. Is it possible to innovate without creativity? And is it possible to be creative without innovating? Defend your position. Okay, this one I found very, very interesting. So I kind of see creativity and innovation as too closely connected, but not the same thing. I don't know how to, they're very similar, but they're not the same. They're very different at the same time. Creativity is like coming up with original ideas or looking at problems from a different perspective, while innovation is more like when those ideas actually get implemented and create real value or change. So I do think that you can be creative without innovating. People come up with ideas all the time that never get used or applied, but that doesn't make them any less creative. Sometimes ideas, they don't move forward because of funding, things like timing, resources, or just because the opportunity isn't there. It's not time. But the thinking process behind them is still creative. And for example, a great example of this would be in another class where I actually had to go ahead and create something called the National Homeless Initiative, which is an idea that had to be original, that proved a lot of things that we knew about the government and whatnot, and a good project or something that hasn't happened yet. And so I came up with something called the National Homeless Initiative. And that idea came from trying to rethink how homelessness could be addressed through civic participation. Reintegration centers and workforce development all working together as a team. And that process required creativity because I wasn't just repeating something from a textbook or summarizing a policy I'd already seen. I had to actually think through how different systems could connect and function together. And I also had to consider things like the structure, implementation, and how different departments might interact. So it wasn't just like a surface level idea. It required a lot of building something from scratch. That's literally what I did. But at the same time, I wouldn't call it an innovation just yet because it hasn't actually been implemented in the real world. It's still just a proposal. It exists as an idea on paper. So if something like that were ever adopted and actually produced measurable results, which would be amazing, like reducing homelessness or improving workforce participation, then I think it would cross the barrier into innovation. And I also don't think that innovation can exist without creativity. Even when organizations improve existing systems, they still need someone to think differently about how to make something better or more efficient. So I see creativity as the starting point, and innovation as what happens when those ideas are actually applied and tested in real life environments. And that is just how that is. So then we were asked another thing. We were asked, under what organizational circumstances would you choose a job candidate who exhibited creative potential but lacked practice creativity experience over a candidate who had worked in an environment where opportunities to develop practice creativity were extensive, but who exhibited less creative potential? And under which organizational circumstances would you choose a candidate with obviously practice creativity skills over someone with creative potential? Now, that's a really good question. So I don't really think there's one correct answer here. I think it depends a lot on what the organization is trying to accomplish and what stage it's in. Like, if a company is growing, expanding, trying to solve new and unpredictable problems, I would lean toward the candidate that has the strong creative potential, even if they don't have a lot of formal experience yet. And the reason for that is that experience can usually be something that is developed over time through training, through mentorship, and exposure to real work situations. But the ability to think creatively, to see problems differently, or come up with new approaches is harder to teach from scratch. For example, in startup environments, things can change very quickly. Roles aren't always clearly defined, and employees often have to figure things out as they go. And in that kind of a setting, someone who can think creatively and adapt quickly is extremely valuable. They don't just, they don't necessarily need to have done the exact job before. They just need to be able to learn and to adjust and contribute ideas as problems come up. While on the other hand, there are situations where I could choose the candidate with practice creativity experience instead. And in more structured environments like healthcare and engineering, or large more established organizations, then creativity still matters, but it has to be applied within these strict boundaries, these rules, these standards, these safety guidelines. And in those cases, someone who already has the experience applying creative thinking within those kinds of boundaries is often more effective right away. They're better for that job because they understand how to innovate without violating procedures or creating unnecessary risk. And in those environments, mistakes can be costly, not just financially, but in terms of safety and compliance. So experience becomes a much stronger factor, right? And so overall, what I would have to say is that I don't think it's about one candidate being better than the other. What I say is it's more about the fit and the timing. If the goal is long-term innovation and growth or something like that, then I would lean more toward the creative potential. But if the goal is immediate performance, immediate response, more stability, reliability, these things I would lean more toward the practiced experience. And that's just how the conclusion goes. That's how the cookie crumbles. Let's just say that. And yeah, this is very interesting thing